You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Last August, Ecuador passed a historic referendum that was more than a decade in the making. Oil accounts for roughly a third of the country's exports, but Ecuadorians voted to stop extraction at a major production site deep in the Amazon. It was part of a global movement called Keep It in the Ground that, you guessed it, is aimed at curbing climate change by keeping oil reservoirs underground. To unpack the history of Ecuador's oil economy and where things currently stand with the referendum, we're airing an excerpt from our sister program, Climate One. It's a conversation between the show's co-host, Ariana Brocious, and Kevin Koenig, a director at the environmental nonprofit Amazon Watch.
Oil was first discovered in Ecuador in the 1940s by Shell Oil, but it was in remote areas of the Amazon and they were unable to sort of get it out of the ground and get it to market. But then in the late 1960s, Texaco came into the northern part of the Ecuadorian Amazon and began to drill for oil. And it was a big thing for the country. The first barrel of oil that came out of the ground in an area known as Lago Agrio was taken to Quito. It was given its own parade. It was blessed by the Archdiocese of Ecuador. And it was really seen as the ticket to, quote unquote, the developing world for Ecuador, right? Oil, it was a new era in Ecuador. It was going to be the panacea that would bring Ecuador out of poverty and basically alleviate, all the ills of Ecuador. And in fact, the opposite happened.
Right. So during 3 decades of oil extraction, Texaco, which was later acquired by Chevron, created an ecological and public health disaster, dumping millions of gallons of toxic wastewater and oil into the Amazon. How did that affect the country's view of oil?
During this time, basically what you had was Texaco operating and really just, drilling and dumping, right, for decades. And people were getting sick. Rainforests were being deforested, oil flares burning 24/7 all throughout the northern Ecuadorian Amazon. And local communities were, bearing the brunt of the extraction, saw their rivers turn black. All of the area that they were operating in was, and still is, indigenous territory of 5 indigenous nations who were, using rivers to fish, to drink, to bathe, to wash clothes. And so they were living amongst oil infrastructure and spills. People saw for the first time the impact of industry in a place like the Amazon. Meanwhile, in other parts of the country, I think questions began to arise because poverty continued. It was not, people began to talk about the resource curse, right? And is this plethora of oil actually leading to more debt and dependency?
So you were brought on in 2008 into the Ecuadorian government to help with a proposal spearheaded by former President Rafael Correa, who wanted to maybe change the equation, right? And sort of see if the international community would support Ecuador in keeping some of that oil in the ground, right? Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So in 2007, when Rafael Correa came into power, and he's sort of a self-defined, leftist, progressive, his administration was filled with a lot of people from civil society, and they were really, I think, thinking outside of the box, right? And Rafael Correa, before he became president, he was economic minister with a different administration, and he was looking at this issue of the connection between oil and debt. And so when he came into power, he, I think, was very eager to think about different ways in which Ecuador could get off of oil. And so the proposal that was put out to the world was also sort of based on this idea of ecological debt, right? And some of the climate conferences and the principle of shared but differentiated responsibility, where Ecuador as a country has not contributed in a significant way to the climate crisis. Meanwhile, northern countries bear the historic responsibility for the climate change problem. So a lot of the proposal to keep fossil fuels in the ground in the ITT fields and ask for international collaboration from northern countries was based on that idea.
And the ITT fields is just the name given to these particular oil fields in this Yasuni National Park, right?
Yeah, so the area of the Yasuni that we're talking about are three oil fields, the Ishpingo, Tambococha, Tiputini fields. And they are one of Ecuador's largest oil fields, right? It's about 800 million barrels of oil. So it's significant reserves. So at the time in 2007, this is a big deal. It is very much a revolutionary idea at the time. No other nation had proposed that, saying we're going to keep one of our largest oil fields in the ground if the world can step up and help offset our foregone revenue.
And so this proposal was floated to the international community, and basically nobody wanted to participate, right? There was not enough willingness on the part of the US, other countries, to compensate Ecuador in exchange for not developing these oil fields, right?
Right. It was put out to the world, and quite honestly, the response was crickets, more or less. It's important to understand, too, at this time, politically, what was happening in Latin America. You had, Correa, a leftist. You had Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. You had Evo Morales in Bolivia. And they were dubbed by politicians and media as the Latin American axis of evil, right? And so the proposal was really seen as almost a ransom. Like Correa was saying, hey, northern countries, give me money or the forest gets it, which is really unfortunate because fast forward to where we are now. I mean, now there's been multiple reports from the International Energy Agency, among others, saying, look, we need to keep 2/3 of fossil fuels in the ground. We need a rapid transition away from fossil fuels. But those reports hadn't come out yet. Right. So the proposal from Correa was really an outlier at the time.
So what's so fascinating is that this proposal to the international community fails, but then it sort of changes shape and becomes a national referendum to do this without compensation from other countries. And so last year, Ecuadorians voted in favor of stopping development of new oil wells in this part of the Yasuni National Park, which is a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, keeping around what I have 726 million barrels of oil underground, does not block drilling in the whole park, just this part of it. How did that referendum come out of this effort from the former president?
Right. The proposal of the government was widely popular in Ecuador. I mean, the polling was showing that 90% of the population was in favor of this new thinking that they could keep fossil fuels in the ground and still have some revenue for their economy. And so Correa in 2013 says, look, the world hasn't stepped up. We didn't get the money we needed, and we're gonna drill there. So in 2013, he announces plans to begin extraction of these oil fields. And the reaction from civil society was swift and strong. I mean, protests erupted around the country in the capital city of Quito, and they began to organize. And a collective was formed called Yasunidos, and they began to collect signatures throughout the country. A couple of years later, they had, obtained 800,000 plus signatures, more than double the amount needed to qualify for a referendum. Unfortunately, though, this is where some questionable electoral practices and maybe just outright corruption began, because in the counting of these signatures and the validation process, the Correa administration basically threw out more than half, leaving it just short of how many signatures were needed for a referendum. Community organizers then took the administration to court and challenged that. That case took almost 10 years to wind its way through the court system until finally, a little over a year ago, the Constitutional Court found that indeed the signatures were valid. There were enough to qualify for a referendum, and that this question of whether or not Ecuadorians were in favor of keeping fossil fuels in the ground in ITT fields, that would go to a vote. However, importantly, what has changed since, that decade, while the case wound its way through the courts, oil drilling began. And so you now had a situation where there was more than 200 wells that were in production in the ITT fields. Roads had been constructed, and there are plans to build up to 600 more wells. So it's a different situation, I think, when they were originally going to place this initiative on the ballot with no oil extraction, to fast forward to last August when the vote happens. They're basically asking voters to say, are you in favor of keeping this in the ground? And that means not extracting anything new, but it also means dismantling and decommissioning that existing production that is currently underway.
Which is a bigger endeavor than never doing it in the first place. So this is such an interesting case for so many reasons, but I want to point out the fact to an American audience. So this is a national referendum, a national vote for activity that would only take part in one corner of the country. So it'd be almost like if Americans were voting collectively on whether or not to allow oil drilling in part of Texas or something. And we hear elsewhere in this episode that some locals who depend on the oil industry aren't thrilled about the decision. That 2 provinces where the vote didn't pass were the 2 main oil producing regions of Ecuador. So though it did pass nationally, and as it sounds like there's a lot of favor in some of the more larger cities, what's been the sense among people about the result of the vote?
I think to a certain extent, the vote speaks for itself in that, it won with 59%, right? It's not quite a landslide, but it was not, it didn't just squeak by, right? This is a large percentage of the population that is in agreement with keeping fossil fuels in the ground there. I think a lot of that vote stems from the contamination that has been so associated in those decades, that toxic legacy of the industry in the country, and people really not buying this myth that oil extraction is the key to development in the future of Ecuador. Certainly in those 2 provinces, that is where the oil industry began. This is where the first Texaco work camp began, and then the industry is built up tremendously in those 2 provinces. It's ground zero for oil companies and oil servicing companies and all the industry that sort of supports the extraction process. So it's not surprising that this question in the referendum might not have passed in those 2 provinces. But at the end of the day, it is a national referendum, right? And so I think it does speak to this question of, as Ecuador moves away from oil extraction, what does a just transition look like for workers and communities that are dependent on the industry?
Mm-hmm. Most domestic oil production is now run by the state-owned Petroecuador, right? What does the current administration feel about this requirement now to stop production, remove the infrastructure? What does that mean in terms of shutting down these wells? How likely are they to comply?
Sure. Since the referendum passed last August 2023, the administration of current President Daniel Noboa, they are certainly dragging their feet. Clearly, the administration, together with Petroecuador, have been doing everything they can to delay implementing this and citing the economic toll to the country, the economic cost of decommissioning these wells and dismantling infrastructure and repairing and remediating areas where extraction has been happening. So there is real concern that the government is, in the short term, not going to comply with this. Once the referendum was passed, the Constitutional Court gave the government a year to comply. And only recently have they even produced a first plan of what this is going to look like. But they're talking about, it will take them 7 to 10 years to actually implement this. But 7 to 10 years, again, the question of biodiversity, of indigenous rights, of isolated peoples, they can't wait.
Kevin Koenig is Climate, Energy, and Extractive Industry Director at Amazon Watch. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us on Climate One.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Despite the referendum's passage last year, leaving oil in the ground is still a hot-button issue for many Ecuadorians. Our producer Mateo Schimpf has the story.
The vote in favor of the referendum to keep oil in the ground, it surprised a lot of people, and it sparked immediate reaction.
A lot of people from the oil industry started speaking up right away. It said, this can't happen. The country's going to go to hell. Oil has been a savior for us, and Ecuador can't afford this.
That's Kimberly Brown.
I'm a freelance journalist based in Quito, Ecuador.
For the past 2 years, Kimberly's been covering the Keep It in the Ground campaign and the referendum vote that followed. Oil's been a linchpin of the country's economy for decades. But many urban and rural Ecuadorians, they disagree about what should happen next. To find out how people living near the oil wells in question are feeling about the vote, Kimberly ventured into the Amazon. It's a long way from Quito. 8 hours by bus to the edge of Yasuni National Park, and then another 5 by boat up the Napo River. Her guide is Homer Machoa, and the two are headed to Yanchama. It's an indigenous Quechua community just a few miles from an oil field affected by the referendum.
Entonces, ¿qué tan cerca es So then, how close is the closest oil well to the village? Is it far from here or what?
Yes, from our spot, we're 9 kilometers from the wells.
In 2023, Homer was part of the Yasunidos campaign. That was a grassroots effort that pushed the issue of stopping oil production in Yasuni to a national vote.
Voting yes to stop it was because we've seen how the oil companies have affected people, how people have suffered from diseases, how people have had to drink contaminated water.
Homer's a young guy, in his early 30s, but he's already spent time working in local government and with Ecuador's Ministry of the Environment. Those were both eye-opening experiences for him, and they stoked his fears about just how much power the oil industry has in Ecuador.
When he was working as a park guard for the Ministry of Environment, he was telling me at one point they saw huge streams of smoke coming out of one of the oil wells.
One time, we parked there at the production center, and suddenly, I don't know what happened, but suddenly the gas started coming up. A huge flame. We wanted to go because if we are from the Ministry of the Environment, we have the right and the obligation to go and see if there was a spill or something. But they didn't allow us. The company is always above the Ministry of the Environment.
So he thought that was not right, that the private company has more say than the Ministry of Environment in who has access to the Amazon and who gets to monitor things. And so he said he quit after that moment.
Homer says that over the years, those oil companies have spent a lot of time courting local residents to allow development on community land. But once the ink dries on a contract, the oil companies and their financial support, they disappear. To Homer, it feels like deception. Like many who voted yes on the referendum, he questions whether oil companies will ever deliver on their promise to surrounding communities.
When I was going around during the campaign, I would say, understand it's been 10 years. How many people are working in the company? What benefits have we seen from them? So most have said, we don't have healthcare attention. There's nothing in terms of social assistance, even worse in infrastructure.
Hola, señora. Hola, ¿puedo entrar?
But others remember back to 2014 when oil reps handed out $3,000 in cash to each resident of the community.
Well, I voted no because I benefit from it.
That's Magdalena Cordoba. Magdalena's 2 sons are the only people in Yanchama who still have jobs in the oil industry.
We can buy machines, for example, a motor, a generator, buy materials to build the house, or a wheelbarrow with the money they earn from working.
Magdalena often wonders whether Ecuadorians who voted yes on the referendum were actually thinking about the people who live near the oil wells.
Of course, we are exploited, yes, but the little I have has served me. The people in the city, they live peacefully. They get what they want.
The divisions, though, they aren't just between rural and urban Ecuadorians. Like a lot of people who live in poor but ecologically diverse parts of the world, Homer is making a go of environmental tourism. From a practical standpoint, it makes sense. But the way Magdalena sees it, if Homer is making money off of bringing tourists to Yanchama, then everyone in the community should get a cut.
He only wants it for himself. That's why people here don't like Homer. They don't want him to be a guide because tourism is a community-based. It's for everyone.
Kimberly said that these kinds of local politics are a big reason that ecotourism hasn't made headway in Yanchama.
They do want to live off the rainforest, but they also want to not live in poverty.
On her way back to Quito, Kimberly passes through Coca. It's a cement city founded on the oil industry.
Coca itself is a city of about 50,000 people. It's a small city, but it's also considered the gateway to the Amazon.
People from surrounding provinces flocked there in the early 2000s to serve as platform and pipeline and ship workers who were moving crude oil from Yasuní to refineries on Ecuador's coast.
But that was maybe 20 years ago. When I was talking to people, they still talk about the importance of the oil industry for all of their businesses, but they also said, like, people don't come through here anymore. We needed to come back.
Mercedes Angora is the manager of Hotel La Misión. She says that during the region's oil boom, hotels and restaurants in Coca were packed with workers. As recently as 2014, La Misión had 40 employees.
And how many people are there now?
Habemos tres.
Tres.
Three. We have three. I'm here. There's the pool attendant and there's the guard. There's no one else.
And are you worried that if they start closing the oil wells in the jungle, well, would that worry you in a way?
Claro, porque por lo menos aquí bajan muchos para los botes.
Of course, because at least a lot of people come here for the boats. At least the dock is rented. They would have to close the dock. There would be no passage through here anymore. That would be stopped. But let's hope that doesn't happen.
After covering the referendum for more than a year, Kimberly's heard all sorts of reasons for why people are against it. But what's most interesting is the way that people feel like the referendum is already affecting them.
Some people were falsely saying that now the oil blocks have closed and there's no business. And that's actually false because those particular oil blocks in the referendum have not closed.
The reality is that once they'd finished building the oil infrastructure, the industry no longer needed all those workers who used to eat and sleep and party in places like Coca. When Ecuador's constitutional court officially recognized the referendum's passage, it gave the government 1 year to make a plan for decommissioning the extraction site in Yasuní National Park. But for the past 6 months, Ecuador's military and police have been caught in a bloody and expensive war with the country's gangs. President Daniel Noboa, who's previously said that the country didn't really need the oil from Yasuní, now can't afford to lose it. In January, he put a moratorium on the Yasuní referendum. That means, for at least 1 more year, oil production will continue. When and if the moratorium does lift, the clock will restart on a plan to phase out extraction in this part of Yasuní. But Kimberly said her biggest concern is for what comes after that.
I think people who have more concrete alternatives need to be working more closely with the government to make those actual plans and put them into action. There is kind of an illness here where every time a new government comes into office, they wipe the slate clean from the government before and start everything new. And that's a problem in making any kind of alternative economy happen.
If you want to check out more of Kimberly's reporting, you can head to KimberlyJBrown.com. For Climate One and On Shifting Ground, I'm Mateo Schimpf.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Mateo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.